photograph that moment if I got shot.
Arc Raiders is a game about hope. At least, that's what it wants us to think. And at first glance, it's easy to see why. The mechanics of Arc Raiders are all about fighting back, about resisting an encroaching doom that can only be surmounted by a wide allegiance to cooperation. A human versus the machine conceit that's immediately present even from just the namesake of the game. And in turn, these escalating forces from enemy AI position the game with a narrative framework hinging on the restorative process of recyclable components scavenged from the destroyed environmental perpetrators. In the post-apocalyptic world of climate catastrophe, it is your participation that is necessary for the fight against despair. Community is paramount. Endurance is rhizomatic. The end of the world is not really the end. To that effect, there's a certain romance to how Arc Raiders treats its apocalypse. A quiet that persists in the fields, sands, pools, shores, and hills of societal decay. A whisper, echoing in that mechanical void as if to say, the idyllic has not yet been compromised. That there is still a chance at reclamation. In this regard, the indomitable human spirit comes alive in the analog aesthetic of tape hums and celluloid fuzz that Arc Raiders forefronts. It burns amongst the patters of rain, against the screeches of the machines, and despite the cacophony of ammunition fired. It soaks itself in these solemn synthesizers of running minor chords, an arpeggio of individual resistances sequenced to stand together, a shout in the void. Or so we think. Wrestling against our restorative narrative linchpin is the genre of the game itself. How we readily breach our propensity for humanitarian care when at the face of collapse. How the crumbling environment twists and compromises the relationships between ourselves and those we meet out in the world. How we prioritize preservation above all else. Because why risk ourselves for a stranger? In the interpretation of aesthetics, hope happens external to the core experience of Arc Raiders. There is no us and them, only you. Resistance is futile. Cooperation is the expression of naivete. Trust is self-sacrificial. Tension against players reigns supreme.
So be friendly.
This is what Arc Raiders does. It sells an idea of overcoming invasion only to position us against each other. To interpolate us with the warmth of vintage memorabilia only to keep us as residual figures.
You're chilling, bro. These motherfuckers were shooting at me. I'm just trying to, shoot some Arkies.
To push us up against the brink of extermination because only then will we be willing to make the choice for compromised morality. To finally turn our back against one another. Why? Because it's tense. Because it's emergent. Because it's fun. Because it's limitless. Because it's human nature. And so that you'll come back to do it again. In the post-apocalyptic world of climate catastrophe, maybe there is no hope. Only annihilation. Arc Raiders wants the world to end. Which begs the question, what can we do to stop it? Cassette futurism, the art style of a future sci-fi world rooted in the lens of technological limitations from the 1960s to 1980s. Both nostalgic for those late 20th century technologies of lo-fi, bulky aesthetics, while simultaneously embedded with the optimism of the promise of a digital future. It is both backward and forward-looking, a digital frontier inside an analog world. Over the last several years, sci-fi games have leaned heavily into this aesthetic. From survival horror to action-adventure RPGs, the visual artifacts in these games frequently feature quintessential elements of cassette futurism. Take, for example, Lunar Software's Routine, where the means of visually decoding your environment relies on the use of the cat, where aiming and shooting with the tool is seen through the blurry scan lines and distorted glass of the CRT screen attached to the stock. And while interactions in the online digital space happen via projections on the wall, the aesthetics remain rudimentary, holding on to Y2K designs through boxy, early internet email. We see the same element in Rose Engine Signalis, not just as interactable screens, but embodied through the operating system of Elster, visualized in boot-up sequences, save screens, and menus. We are a walking example of these sensibilities. And upcoming Naughty Dog title Intergalactic: The Heretic Prophet invokes the 80s, not just with its naming convention, but with its brand abundance and lo-fi tech, decorating the interior of Jordan's ship. Fashion and 80s anime art styles aren't just referential, it's full-on nostalgia, with the ethos of the 80s promising a future of wealth and security simply by virtue of having access to these recognizable possessions. There's an implication here by invoking this specific aesthetic and leveraging nostalgia, that things right now are actually bad, that there's something rotten in the greater context of the outside setting and respective future, that we must go back to a world that is not just intrinsically human, but full of tangible potential. Arc Raiders builds its world entirely in these sensibilities. Buttons, dials, and CRT televisions make up the walls and rooms of the central traders from the underground hub. VHS scan lines permeate through the intermittent cutscenes as aesthetic tone setters. Trinkets are comprised of loot from the sonic analog, with rare vinyl and high-value mixtapes. Even the extra-textual videos of promotional material leverages film grain for each trailer. These aren't just social media bites. They're artifacts, documentation, operated by some enigmatic figure, but nonetheless human. A part of the work itself meant to help make meaning. And yet humanity stands underneath the collated hierarchy of technologic evolution with the invasion of the Ark, who now run rampant topside. Rocketeers patrol the skies in deep chugs of motorized hums. Ark probes jet down from above and search for the remains of humanity through echolocation of sonar pings. Pops and wasps scream in high-pitched screeches when alerted to exposed raiders. And shredders roam in the deafening propulsion of jet exhaust, awaiting to blast their all-encompassing shrapnel. Despite their aesthetic development, the Ark are still nonetheless mechanical. Their smooth, spherical, otherworldly design counterbalanced with retrofitted joints, hatches, propellers, and metal. An alien automaton still confined to echo those lo-fi limitations. They each have their limits. Thus, humanity fights back because they believe they are still within reach of asserting engineered dominance back over the machine. Crafting weapons, explosives, and utilities in the workshop out of fallen Ark parts is, in its own right, an act of reclamation. But just as important as all these artifacts that make up the lo-fi aesthetic are the feeling they invoke. The narrative purpose for leveraging style, art as part of the text in making meaning.
A couple of thematics that we knew we were excited about was, of course, the impending sort of ecological collapse, the rise of AI and the man versus machine angle.
Thematically, Arc Raiders is in line with the aesthetic of cassette futurism writ large. There's a hope buried underneath its post-apocalyptic setting, that a fighting chance at survival is not out of the question, that humanity can claw back from its remorseful naivete. All of it through the lens of chasing a comfort from the analog of yesteryear, the effect of the art and the effect of playing. One of the ways to emphasize this effect is through texture, not just from the visual artifacts themselves, but through the sound and music from the game as a part of the aesthetic. Just before the second tech test, Patrick Andren, one of Arcraiders' composers, had this to say about the game's score. It's the sound of wires, oscillators, filter sweeps, voltages, and late-night madness. That he and composer Johan Söderqvist went deep into the analog cave for this one. Modular rigs humming, vintage synths, and a mess of patch cables to build a sonic world. And that the result is a score pulsing with tension and texture, gritty bass lines, glitched out arps, and the occasional tape-warped moment of beauty. It's this sonic tension that interests me the most, able to echo that same thematic duplicity from its aesthetic, but in the form of audio. The synthesizer is the main instrument for the score of Arcraiders, what I would call the paramount connective tissue that makes up the audio landscape to firmly establish the aesthetic effect of the game. It does this in a really subtle way that isn't all that easy to immediately place, but one you register as undeniably there underneath the music. By creating tension through its chord progression, with the dominant key of a song changing from one bar to the next, the synthesizer is able to leverage the feeling of an underlying gentle sadness. From song to song, both minor chords and major chords are always working in tandem, frequently trading places as the dominant key of a song to complement the feeling each track evokes. It is shared work, a song in emotional liminality, a feeling hard to place. The result, a bittersweet sound for a wistful world. To detail more precisely what I mean, let's listen to the running arpeggio from one of the game's more prominent songs. That was 5 seconds of just the lead, nothing else, just synth. And already there's an encompassing texture of something grand, an early establishment of that hard-to-place feeling of a sweeping, hopeful melancholia. In these bars, the opening seconds are dominated by falling movement from the synthesizer. The lead is primarily oscillating down, evoking a somber tone. But in the next bar, that sentiment is flipped. The lead oscillates back up. Suddenly, there's now a rising movement from the synth. The dominant key switches to reclaim the opening sadness back toward a sense of hope. Let's listen again, and this time, try and track that rising and falling movement happening in each bar. Immediately, we have that clear tension Andren was talking about. Rise and fall, major and minor, there is shared space that complicates pinpointing an exact emotional response. That tension, this dominant chord interplay in the keys, leaves us then with a lingering uncertainty. A sonic melancholia meant to bring us closer and immerse ourselves in the stakes of the game. Even just through music, thematically, were interpolated just the same. So then, okay, what is the effect here? What does Arcraiders want to say by leveraging these feelings? These aesthetics, after all, do serve some kind of narrative purpose. Sonically, Arcraiders uses the chord interplay in its music to help establish a sense of hope found within its dystopian setting. And even though this is only one specific, isolated example taken from an entire album of original score, it's this chord tension that presents itself as the running motif across the entirety of the music. The specific made holistic, an emblematic element of its central thesis. Warmness can still be found in melancholic liminality. And by the way, that track, it's called Speranza, the Italian word for hope. But this is an extraction shooter. Themes only get you so far. While feelings evoked from the score are already inherently hard to qualify in an analytical sense, more troubling is the tension in the uncertainty of the player versus player encounters. Gameplay diffuses and erodes the narrative of hope because the site of our meaning-making happens solely as an external framework from the nature of the genre. In other words, there's a clear divide between what the game is implicitly saying and what we as player agents are potentially doing. For all the hard work Arc Raiders does to set up its reclamation narrative through cooperation, its trailers, its quests, and its video documentaries, it is instead immediately betrayed by its very own tutorial. Here, raiders knock you while you're breaching a door and rob you of all your newly scavenged loot, leaving you without a single item. It's an introduction that works to set up the PvP foundation of the game as one that is demonstrably more treacherous than its core PvE loop. There is tension in potential betrayal, and yet it's the following moments that instead concern me the most. After fighting Ark and pressing a panel button for the exfil cargo elevator, a voice comes on the radio.
Whoever this is, you're not supposed to use this elevator. Lucky for you, I'll make an exception. Wait a second.
That voice is most likely Shani, the head of security and trader of Speranza. And while it makes sense she'd be skeptical and paranoid about a roaming stranger, nonetheless, the message is clear. At the footsteps of one of humanity's final bastions, at one of the few remaining safe havens on Earth, and in the midst of ongoing restorative operations, you were not supposed to be here. You were not meant to be included. In a matter of minutes, Arc Raiders positions itself as a game that is inadvertently duplicitous. Outside the framework of hopeful restoration exists a different kind of tension, one of probable deception from players just like yourself. A framework that isn't just inherent to the genre of extraction shooters, but intrinsic to the capabilities of humanity itself.
Hey, Raider, Raider, Raider!
If betrayal is an option, there will always be someone willing to make that choice.
Where do you think you're going? Next time, use your mic.
So then, how do we make some kind of tangible meaning from this friction? If Arc Raiders' aesthetic design elements point toward the post-apocalypse as a site for reclamation against the machine, if the presence of analog in the game is inherently tied to the optimistic qualities of humanity, then how can it also betray those sentiments entirely? How do we make sense of a game that is saying one thing, but doing another? Can we parse through disparate design?
I'm a photographer, and I want to be a war photographer, actually.
Civil War is a confused movie. A self-serious contemporary war drama posing as a critique of Western political and journalistic institutions, but failing to really unearth some assemblage of a meaningful thesis. Like Arc Raiders, Alex Garland's film relies heavily on its visual aesthetics to help establish the themes it wants to explore. Undeniably, the audio-visual landscape of the movie here is extremely compelling. Cinematography mirrors would-be shot compositions for artistic photographs. Intense acoustics and authentic reverbs from gunfire heighten tense sequences while immersing viewers further into scenes.
Breakout, breakout, breakout!
And most importantly, POV shots highlight both the subjects in frame as artifacts as well as the professional qualities of who is behind the camera. The disciplinary makeup of Civil War tells us this should be a movie that scrutinizes the effects of political extremism and the holistic impact of documentation. However, it ultimately doesn't. going out of its way to obfuscate pointed readings of the film at times. Regrettably, this is where any deeper interrogation fundamentally stops. And again, like Arc Raiders, Civil War inadvertently communicates opposing messaging that is at odds with its aesthetics. A movie both about the communicative power and systemic influence of on-the-ground primary reporting, but also its supposed lack of meaningful impact.
Lee's lost her faith in the power of journalism.
Journalism as a diametrically opposed entity in the sphere of influence, which is, I think, extremely unfortunate. To have a backdrop so provocative be only in service of dull, incomplete analysis. This is a movie gesturing in broad strokes about big ideas, bearing no fruit between what the film does and what it says. A half measure of thematic meditation. I have to be clear that this isn't a video about the movie Civil War. A full analysis of the film is outside the scope and would ultimately result in a different video altogether. Admittedly, initial research for this video led me down an entire avenue on how Civil War primarily sees the aim of journalism and its supposed obligation to complete objectivity.
Once you start asking yourself those questions, you can't stop. So we don't ask. We record so other people ask. You want to be a journalist? That's the job.
Hey, Lee,
What?
back off.
That's a completely different element of the movie and, while interesting and related, and worth its own dissection, doesn't fit with where we're concerned. Still, there's plenty of great analysis out there doing deeper reads of the film that I'd suggest pursuing. One which I find really helpful to extend conversations of the film in the context of Arc Raiders is by Mariana Colleen for her channel, The Morbid Zoo, which I would highly recommend. Instead, how we'll discuss Civil War is as an extended analogy for how it and Arc Raiders both explore their theses. Before anything else, I have to assert that Civil War is not a movie about nothing. Though the specifics of its fictional history are largely ambiguous, sure, the politics themselves are resoundingly clear. I am not unique to point out the obvious depictions of right-wing authoritarianism.
Some are already calling it the greatest victory in the history of military campaigns.
Nor the calamitous economic ramifications
300 buys you a sandwich. We got ham or cheese?
300 Canadian.
that extremist ideologies can have. Or the explicit racism
What kind of American are you?
that helps make up the setting of the film. Of course, a centrist, Western European like Garland would look at the partisan issues of a divided, real-world United States and think, yeah, the country's politicians are leaving their own people out to dry, exacerbating a sense of voluntary obedience. It's why a scene like this...
No one's giving us orders, man. Someone's trying to kill us. We are trying to kill them.
You don't know what side they're fighting for.
Oh, I get it. You're retarded. You don't understand a word I say.
exists to tell us exactly how Garland views the ideological divide of a real-world 2020s United States. But this is all backdrop. Through the content of the movie, Civil War is not specifically about this political context. It's relevant, sure, but only to help illustrate the contemporary institution of journalism. More specifically, photojournalism. Civil War cannot come to a consensus for how it sees photojournalists, giving us one read through its formalism, but offering another through the actual content within the film. A stark divide between what it is doing and what it is saying. Through one reading, Civil War lauds photojournalists, and by extension, journalism, as a collective of professionals who contribute and hold institutional power by way of their work. These are people with skill, who dedicate themselves to their craft for the purpose of providing a public service. It does this through having two characters, Lee and Jesse, embody this through demonstration, literally by seeing them work. Jesse, albeit an amateur, trying to break into a position in the press, is a person who excels at her craft. She shoots on film, black and white film stock on one of two 35mm Nikon FE2s, to be precise. These aren't easy to use. It's not just point and shoot. Although there is an aperture priority setting on the camera, meaning the camera meters light through the lens and automatically picks the best shutter speed, and assuming Jesse is using this setting, there is still a big manual requisite in order to properly produce results with the camera. Things like loading film, manually focusing the lens, and most importantly, setting correct exposure settings before capturing every picture. She's praised here for going old school, even giving us backstory that her cameras are hand-me-downs. Nonetheless, she's able to operate these with resounding competence. After all, it's her inexperience in the field that holds her back, and not supposed inaptitude with her gear. It doesn't end here. Her professionalism is heightened later in the film when we get to watch Jessie develop her film herself, demonstrating to Lee, her mentor in the context of the film, her secret to producing great scans for on-the-road development.
Body temperature. Smart. Thank you.
She literally becomes an embodiment of utility in service of exhibiting skill. The implication is clear. Even people lower in the professional hierarchy, the amateurs, the freelancers, the ancillary grunts, are still demonstrating undeniable expertise. Despite the friction and limitations of analog gear, expensive photo stocks, or guerrilla scanning, these are people who make it happen. Lee exists on the extreme end of the professional spectrum. She is a veteran of her field, a hardened expert with a portfolio of work that holds great societal significance. Though they've assuredly scarred her, she's nonetheless documented major historical events. She even shares her name with real-life photojournalist and World War II war photographer, the late Lee Miller. Naturally, it only makes sense why Jessie looks up to Lee for inspiration. However, Lee's traits go further than just idolization for Jessie. These are signifiers. Through her expensive, professional-grade camera and lenses, her Kevlar vests and ride helmets, her press identifiers and quotas, hell, her employment itself, all work to illustrate status. She is a professional, a skilled, hired person of dependence with a role of civil service through her expertise. She is capable of truth and qualified influence. Compounded, these collective traits on display throughout the film signify one undeniable fact about Lee, about Jessie, about Joel, about Sammy, about any member of the press who is out there willing to stake their life for the purpose of disseminating information. Their work is of great importance. It matters, and it is necessary for the constituents of a global society. At the same time, Civil War says things throughout the movie that compromise this read entirely, effectively stating that journalists, and by extension, journalism, is essentially powerless. That despite the work, photojournalism is of inefficacy, and thereby cannot influence, much less inform the major public. One of the ways Civil War does this is by intentionally leaving the mechanics of the job vague. Sure, we can assume there is actual work being done in between the scenes that make up the content of the film. We do, after all, have one scene where Lee tries to upload some of her photos, but there is nothing beyond gesturing that they work for Reuters. Nothing on readership. Nothing on the effect the stories have on audience. There are no interviews, no follow-ups, and no formal desires to document impact. We are in the midst of a civil war, and people, the civilian victims, are worse than tertiary, worse than background. They are absent, ignored. For Civil War, photojournalism exists solely to document aesthetics through distant objectivity. No more, no less. I can't help but think about the scene in the stadium here. It's one of the 3 times we get a glimpse at civilian life. The first time is in Brooklyn, where we see civilians rioting against police in a protest for access to water. The third time is the scene in the town that is privileged enough to fundamentally ignore the war and live in isolation under a willful ignorance. But the second time, in the stadium, feels different. Here, there is aid given. There are families playing, kids running. There's campfires and laughter, and most importantly, a community fighting to persist. This should be a turning point, an affirmation about the indomitable human spirit pressing for reclamation in the face of dire circumstances. But it isn't. Earlier, Lee says,
"Every time I survived a war zone and got the photo, I thought I was sending a warning home. Don't do this." But here we are.
For Civil War, this stadium was an inevitability, the only logical conclusion in the realities of war. That nothing could have stopped this from happening. That photojournalism is fundamentally inept in influencing a collective conscience. That the work was a waste of time. And so, here's my problem with Civil War. Firstly, we know this not to be true. Journalism can, and often does, hold the power to influence, especially in the ubiquitous internet era. US politicians constantly seek to tighten their grasp on information control under the guise of national security. And foreign states have increased incentive to pursue algorithmic suppression for fear of swaying perception of news toward unfavorable realities outside their respective agendas. In fact, this is something the movie even agrees with, stating,
"They shoot journalists on sight in the Capitol. They literally see us as enemy combatants."
Why? Because journalists...
I need a quote.
Even in their confused institutional state,
Yeah. They'll do.
still have the ability to be harbingers of truth and information over a corrupt presidency that obfuscates fact. Secondly, and more importantly, this viewpoint on journalism's supposed powerlessness, based on what the movie says, could not be more disparate from the former's argument based on what the movie does. These are two mutually exclusive positions. They exist diametrically opposed to one another. They cannot coexist. And so Civil War cannot come to a clear conclusion on how it views photojournalism. As a result, it's up to us to extrapolate some kind of meaning based on these opposing arguments. This is why I think the scene in the stadium is so important. For the first and maybe only time, agency of the individual to persist is reflected clearly in the background. If we were to take a semiotics reading of the film, to criticize the destruction of American ideologies through the suburban symbols of malls, gas stations, homes, and parking lots, then what can a scene like this stadium convey? Here, there is nothing but the insurmountable power of a humanitarian collective enduring in the face of an empire's collapse. And even though Garland isn't even remotely concerned with this kind of reading, I think this scene defiantly communicates something about our reality. There is agency through collective effort to reclaim a sense of hope. Arc Raiders is a game about hope. Despite its antithetical framework, there is still nonetheless an intervention for interpretation located in all its thematic conflict, one we've actually already mentioned. Key in this argumentative linchpin, however, is the mechanical expression for how we overturn the tension of the extraction shooter. In other words, how we leverage agency through gameplay to do good. It is both what we do with other players and how we understand that relationship as a narrative of hope. I have to amend an earlier conclusion from this essay. I was not giving you the full context, and thus not utilizing the full scope of the medium to form a firmer argument. Narrative is not defined exclusively by the parameters of computer-generated cutscenes or marketing teasers for seasonal events. After all, Arc Raiders is, in fact, a video game. Meaning-making happens within the act of play. And there is actual, real human agency that in turn interpolates a sense of sociological respite, even inside the extraction genre. Enemy combat, environmental quests, player interactions, stash organization. These are all tied to experience. Just as much as we are capable of perpetuating the dystopic tendencies for treachery, so too are we able to maintain the pursuit of a restorative, utopian enclave. We have the propensity to create community. For many, this is the experience that informs their understanding of Arc Raiders, one that reigns supreme over any sort of humanitarian dejection. A community of friendlies, gatherers, collaborators, heroes, photographers. In this way, playing Arc Raiders with the agency of cooperation embodies the critical dystopia. The belief that dystopia can be overcome, that apocalypse can lead to restoration, that the war on hope hinges on the propensity of the individual to choose to be good. This doesn't mean tension is eroded completely, nor is it sublimated when betrayed by another player while out in raid. In fact, I think the choice to engage in the cooperative reinforces that notion of tension over and over again, to hold on to that belief that your compatriot has not yet been compromised by despair, to cling to it so desperately that there cannot possibly be another outcome. It is this belief that supersedes all other notions of sociological depravity. Optimism has to succeed in the face of adversity, especially when it seems easier to compromise on any self-bestowed morals. It is true in life, and it is especially true in the expression of play in the context of the game. If betrayal is an option, then it is true there will always be someone willing to make that choice for treason. Then it must be undeniably agreeable that the inverse is also true, that someone will be wholeheartedly willing to choose community and hope time and again. Arc Raiders is indisputably precarious in this regard. We know this. We've seen its shaky theses perpetuated by complicating what it does. But this likewise cannot holistically inform the entire experience. It is not enough to simply decode its presentations of genre-affirming treachery and call it dystopic, apocalyptic, pessimistic, hopeless, whatever, but to interpret the experience of play as the ultimate site of meaning-making. If the analog aesthetics and themes of environmental reclamation offer the space to interpret Arc Raiders as a narrative of hope, then it is the agency from my experience that gives that argument shape. And it's why Arc Raiders is aggression-based matchmaking, of being placed in lobbies and paired with other raiders just as likely or unlikely to participate in violence, proves to be a vital element for how we understand the game as hopeful, especially when it first released. That there could exist this seemingly socially engineered space based on the sense of community, and more importantly, that humanitarian identity still persists so strongly today. Rebecca Solnit, human rights activist, author, and critical essayist, tells us that in the face of adversity, optimism must always succeed, that we must resist the ease of despair, that hope is an earned action rather than a passive gift, that it is an active pursuit, one that requires sustained agency, an axe you must break down doors with in an emergency. Arc Raiders is a game about hope because I choose to believe it's about hope. It's about hope because I utilize the full extent of my interactive agency to deny any sense of sociological despair. I fight the overwhelming waves of Arc and choose to believe I am an agent of restoration. I fail and re-queue for another raid because I choose to believe my existence is proof of endurance. I am not deterred by adversity. I am not privy to environmental distress. I am not coaxed by solastalgia. I thrive in it. I exist as my own semiotic ideology and embody every last drop of humanitarian aspiration. In my parameters of experience, hope is the only outcome. So then, why the genre of the extraction shooter? Why the melancholy score? Why the post-apocalyptic setting? Why the analog aesthetics? Why the thematic rot? Well, to say one thing, the same thing we remind ourselves over and over again each time we shoot ourselves topside. This is a game about the end of the world, an extraction shooter, one that exists not to showcase the compromised tendencies of societal decay, but to prove that they can be denied, to highlight that there are people who are willing to foster the restoration of humanity despite despair, and to scream at the edge of the void that this philosophy is perpetually essential. Arc Raiders wants the world to end. This much is true. But lucky for us, there's hope in the apocalypse.